So let's talk ribs. Usually when you're thinking of ribs, you think of this thing, right? Long, thin, with the beautiful curvature in it, attachments for the external, internal, intercostal muscles, along with some other muscles. And that's, for the most part, we actually have names for them, standard and atypical ribs. So this would be a standard rib. But we also have some atypicals, and we'll go over this in lecture, but this would be rib 1. As you can see, it is an atypical rib. Now, it does have some of the common features. It has a head, and it has the curvature in the shaft, but you can see it's much smaller in comparison to a standard rib, if I zoom out a little bit. So, wrong way. So you guys can see they're much different in size and length. It doesn't have all of the same articulations and all the same landmarks as the other rib, and we're going to talk about more about this in lecture. But this is the first rib. Hard to palpate, sits underneath the clavicle, much sharper bend, but this would be your first rib. And then we kind of grow a little bit into the second rib, which is right here. So still much bigger, but still has a very pronounced curvature. So if I compare the second rib to a more traditional rib, you can see again, it's still smaller. But here we're going to get the head. We have a neck, which is a standard part, and we have the shaft with the curvature of the rib, and we are getting a articulating tubercle up here. So this would be our second rib. And our other sort of atypical would be our last rib. So this is rib 12, kind of looks like just like a little snaggle tooth. It doesn't have the same articulating facets. It doesn't have an articulation over here. It kind of looks like a tooth. So this would be our floating rib 12. But let's talk about a typical rib. So this is a typical rib, and our typical ribs have pretty standardized landmarks, and we'll go through them. And I will actually grab I'll grab this one. This one's actually a little bit better. So the first one we look at on the rib is the head. So there's the head right there. You can see what it looks like. And then you're going to notice on the head there's a little, let me get this in view, a little ridge right there. That's the crest of the head. And so when the rib is positioned like this, I'm going to come down so you guys can see it. There's a superior and an inferior articulating facet, and the crest of the head is the dividing mark. So again, I'll take my pen here, make it a little bit easier. So this little area right up here, that's going to be the superior articulating facet. Down there, that's the inferior articulating facet, and there's a little ridge that separates them. That is the crest of the head. When we get to articulations, we're going to make sure we understand what each of these facets articulate with. The next major landmark we have is our neck. The neck obviously connects the head to the body or the shaft, and this whole long thing is considered the shaft. You're going to notice that right about here, we have what's called the angle, the costal angle, where the rib makes that turn. Because remember, the rib is posterior. It starts on the spine back here, and it has a sharp angle so it can wrap around to the anterior side and actually make a rib cage. So there's the costal angle, and you can see it right there. If I put it this direction, you can see the angle that way. But the other landmarks we have, right by where the neck joins the shaft, you're going to see a little bump right there. And then see, make sure the shadowing's okay. That's the articulating tubercle. All right, and this is going to articulate with the transverse process of the vertebrae. And there's a little ridge up above it. That's the non-articulating tubercle, and that is for ligamentous attachment. So you have the bigger, more prominent articulating tubercle right there, which you can easily see. And then this little roughed area right next to it, that's the non-articulating tubercle, which is going to be for a ligament. I'm just going to rotate it and spin it a little bit so you can appreciate it from all the angles. Okay? Then on the inside of the rib, you're going to have this little groove. This is the costal groove, which allows vessels to pass through. If you look at this way, you can actually see the groove hopefully a little bit better. I'm going to come in here. So this little costal groove right in through here. This allows vessels to be protected because this is the inside of the rib. So if anything hits the outside of the rib or hits your rib cage, these vessels are protected on the inside. So pretty ingenious way of doing that. So that leaves us with basically everything in terms of our rib. Now, what it does leave us is the vertebrae. Now, this is a standard thoracic vertebrae. When we do the spine, we'll go through all the distinct features of the vertebrae. But of note is that the rib articulates with the vertebrae in 3 spots. Okay? It's going to articulate at the vertebral body. It's going to articulate at the intervertebral disc. It's going to articulate with the vertebral body above it, and it'll articulate the transverse process. So although I said 3, I actually meant 4. Now, I don't know which vertebrae these are in terms of number. I'm just grabbing 2 random. So if they don't line up perfectly, it's just because I'm reaching into a big box of vertebrae. But for the most part, your vertebrae kind of stack, we'll do it this way, kind of stack like this. Agreed? So that's how our vertebrae stack up. Now, what happens here with the ribs and how they articulate? I'm going to remove the top vertebrae. I'm going to put it off to the side for a second. We know that this is the spinous process right here, and we know that that's going to be facing posterior. This is the vertebral body. We know this is going to be facing anterior. Right? The way the rib articulates, it starts, I'm going to spin it. So this is anterior facing you. The rib, the inferior facet of the head of the rib articulates right here with the vertebral body. So you can see, whoops, where it articulates with the vertebral body. Right up in there. Okay, I'm going to angle a little bit so you can see it. And you can even see there's a little bit of a rough spot right there on the vertebral body for that to articulate with. Okay? As it articulates, the rib is still going posterior, and that allows it to then articulate. The articulating tubercle articulates with the transverse process. So you can see the articulating tubercle articulates with that nice roughed area on the transverse process. So you can see the rib actually starts heading posteriorly because it has to articulate with that transverse process. And then the costal angle bends it forward. Okay? Now, what that leaves us with, if I spin it this way, is we still have the superior facet on the head of the rib is still exposed. That is going to articulate with the vertebrae above it. So if I bring back that superior vertebrae, and you can see that's this relationship right here. So the inferior facet actually articulates with the vertebral body. The crest of the head articulates with the disc, which I don't have here, but there'd be a disc in between these 2 vertebral bodies. And the superior facet of the head of the rib articulates with the vertebrae above it. And then the articulating tubercle articulates with the transverse process. Now let's put numbers to it, just to confuse you a little bit more. Let's say, for purposes, it doesn't really matter, but let's say this is T5 and this is T6. Okay? So T5 is on top, T6 is on the bottom. What number rib is this? Well, the number rib numerically corresponds to the transverse process articulation and the inferior facet articulation. So the inferior facet articulates with vertebrae 6, the transverse process articulates with vertebrae 6, and the superior facet articulates with vertebrae 5. Okay, so if I rotate it a little bit, so that superior facet is articulating with vertebrae 5 up here. The inferior facet is articulating with vertebrae 6 down here, and the transverse process is articulating, our transverse process of vertebrae 6 is articulating with the rib. All right, now if we take this, and I'm going to move the camera, we're actually going to look now at the rib. We're going to look at our skeleton right here, so you can see exactly how that looks in practice. So these are multiples. So you can see we can basically just count on down. We'll start all the way at the top. Let's see how well our counting is. So we're going to count down. See 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's C7. I'm going to change the angle of the camera. There we go. There's C7. So this is T1, T2, T3, T4. So we'll just pick randomly T4. And if we look at T4, there's the T4 transverse process. It is articulating right there with the articulating tubercle of rib 4. And as we come on in, I'm actually going to take the GoPro. We're going to go right inside. We are now inside the rib. And you can see how the inferior facet is articulating with the vertebrae. The crest is articulating with that orange vertebral disc. And the superior facet is articulating with the vertebrae above it. So that's how we number all of them. So if I'm right here, well, I'll go down one. There we go. I'm here. I'm going to take the GoPro and bring it up a little bit so we can see it. So if that is rib 3, that means that the inferior facet is articulating with vertebrae 3. The transverse process is articulating with rib 3. And then up here, that would be vertebrae 2. So that is how your ribs and your vertebrae articulate. So it's much more complicated than most people believe, but that is also